So a little intro. Hello, everybody. My name is Rachel McMillan. I write historical fiction for HarperCollins. This is my friend of almost 20 years now,
Yeah.
Mike Ledermueller. And Mike is not only the world's biggest Toronto Wolfpack rugby fan, he's also the technical director at the Canadian Opera Company out of the Four Seasons here in Toronto. And if you make a donation to the Canadian Opera Company right now, it will be matched. So support opera during the pandemic.
Until June 30th.
Until June 30th. What else can we say about Mike? He is married to my best friend, Kat, and he has two adorable kids, Sam and Luke, who I love. And Mike and I are enthusiasts, not experts, but I use Bletchley Park in my two most upcoming historical fiction writer books. This one is The London Restoration. It comes out in August, and my heroine does work at Bletchley. And then next June, I have a book coming out called The Mozart Code, and the heroine in that also works at Bletchley Park. So you get to see a bit of the day-to-day life. But that is what we're here for tonight is VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, 75th anniversary. And we just wanted to dive a little bit into why Bletchley Park is important, the really cool, nerdy code stuff that Mike's an enthusiast of. And when I was writing London Restoration and I knew I wanted to incorporate Bletchley, both Mike and I have at separate times spent time at Bletchley Park. But I knew that I would need someone to help me with all the sciencey, crypto, computery stuff because my brain doesn't work that way. So I'm going to just give a bit of an overview about what Bletchley Park was, what daily life there was, and then Mike is going to bring out some really neat toys, especially in conjunction with the Enigma machine, the German Enigma, as well as the bombe machine that was created by Alan Turing to help decode what they were receiving with Enigma and helped crack the Enigma code. And for most of you, all of this was popularized by, look at my prop, the Imitation Game, which came out several years ago. And that's when I think for the most part, a lot of the world experienced Bletchley Park for the first time. So now that we're all here, so in 1938, in September, before the war even happened, a congregation met at a Victorian manor in Buckinghamshire, and they called it Captain Ridley's shooting party. And it wasn't actually a shooting party. It was 150 men and women from MI6, from the government and code and cipher school, meeting under the guise of a weekend away, whereas actually they were activating an incredible secret war station that would help the Allies win the war. In 1938, the German Enigma code had not been broken. The Enigma was pretty much unstoppable. It was really complex, but Mike will tell you more about that. And the threat of the belligerent Italian Navy made the higher ups, especially in the Admiralty and in MI6, think that they might have to get something in place because they didn't want any threat to come to Britain, especially via the sea. So Admiral Hugh Sinclair, the sea director of the Government Code and Cipher School out of London, headed by Commander Alistair Dennison since 1919. So Bletchley Park is kind of the forerunner after the code breaking that happened in Whitehall in the Admiralty, room 40. You can Google it after. They had code breaking happening back then. This is an offshoot. So he bought this Victorian rambling manor that was near a small village and away from London, which we know a year after would be blitzed, but also what they called as being on the varsity line, which means that it had equal space between it, London, Oxford, and Cambridge. So they had easy access and transportation and geography to some of the smartest minds in the country. So Hugh Sinclair buys the manor, and over the next year, they move in everything from filing cabinets to bookshelves to create this branch of the government code and cipher school that would be top secret. If you worked there, you had to sign the Official Secrets Act, which forbade you from talking about what you did there, not only to the other people who might have worked in another hut or building, but even to your spouses and family. And for several decades after the war, women and men who worked there, mostly women actually, there were 3 times as many women there as men, often because men were fighting, they were not allowed to say anything. And for the most part, they didn't. And it's interesting that this world included Professor Alan Turing, who's perhaps one of the most famous people to come out of the Bletchley story. He was an eccentric fellow. He was a genius. He was the one who, of course, created the idea for the bomb machine that we're going to look at. But he also was a bit of an interesting fellow. When you go to Bletchley, you can visit his office in Hut 8, and you can see that he used to keep his tea mug chained to the radiator there so nobody would steal it. But he also had a habit of, because of the German threat, melting down nickels and coins, nickels, it's Britain, sorry, coins, and burying them around the grounds, but he would always forget where he had buried it so that he had currency later. And it was a multifaceted place, meaning there were so many things happening in so many different places. And I was just going to bring up here, this is a map of Bletchley. At first, it was just this huge red manor house, of which Mike will show you a picture of later. But as they needed more room for code breaking, for more workers, they ended up building all of these huts. And it's within the past, I think, 10 years that they've actually opened up a lot of these huts to visitors, which means you can go and see what it was like to work there day to day. And one of the other exceptional things about Bletchley, and one of the ways that it allowed them to break as many codes as they did and have such a far-reaching influence, is every message that was intercepted, whether it was just someone listening forever, was filed and kept. So nothing was thrown away. And after, they could go back and cross-reference and see if they missed something that would allow them to anticipate some of the patterns they would need to break the codes. Now, if you've seen The Imitation Game, you know that at the very end of the film, there's this scene where all of the workers are around these big bonfires burning everything. And that is because Churchill worried that anyone could get a hold of this information. And of course, the Soviet threat in 1945 was really prominent. Many people believe that they were just leaving one war to go into another. And so they destroyed it all. But the sad thing is, a lot of what they destroyed turned out to be the predecessor for what we know as the computer. And if we had had many of these things that the men and women there created, can you think of how even more technologically advanced we would be? I see a Luke. Hi, Luke. So that's a bit of the history around Bletchley Park. There were many smart people who came out of there. And when Alfred Dilly Knox recruited for Bletchley for people to intercept the messages, he went for people who had rigorous academic backgrounds. So that could include women who were exceptional in foreign languages. It could include chess masters. Hugh Alexander was very proficient in chess, and included people who saw the world in a slightly different way, and often in a very smart way. And that is what's so interesting about it, is that it was a mind war in contrast with all of the fighting that was happening at the front. And that's what fascinates me. But it was not a perfectly secure place. After, you can Google John Cairncross, who was actually a spy, a double agent, who was one of the Cambridge spies that came out of that network in the 1930s. Later, he did a lot of work for MI6, but he, of course, was the famous traitor out of Bletchley. Who knows if there weren't other things going on. Anyway, so Mike, I've given an overview of what Bletchley did and talked about the Enigma machine and the bomb machine, but can you tell us why it was so important for them to build this entire thing Yes, around other threats like perhaps Italian Navy, belligerent Italian Navy intelligence, but around the uncrackable Enigma. Why was cracking Enigma so important?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that if you're about to be in a war, everybody knew this was coming. Like, this was there was a threat of war, and
Mhm.
there's a huge advantage if you know what your enemy is going to be doing. So during World War I, they had some success in reading German codes that existed then. So it made sense that they should be doing that again. The problem was there was a new way of making codes or making ciphers that was really perplexing, and that the English had a really hard time cracking. The English, the French, the Poles were all working on this, and the English had a really terrible time getting into the Enigma machine specifically. Um, and it's yeah, I mean that's the big advantage if you know what your enemy is doing. So to communicate between units or different units in the army, they would communicate by radio wave and use Morse code. So if you're broadcasting a radio wave, anybody can hear it. So in Britain, they had listening stations where they were listening to all that Enigma traffic or all this traffic and recording it down, like you said. And so, but if your traffic is being heard by your enemy, you got to find some way that's going to keep it secret so that nobody else can read it. And Enigma for the Germans was the way that they did the bulk of their enciphering for their codes.
So they encrypted everything so that your random Hut 3 person with the earphones on can't intercept those messages.
Or anyone. Once it's out there, once you broadcast it on radio, everyone can hear it. So you got to make sure you have a way that only you and the person whose the message is intended for can hear it.
And talk to me a little about um, how you had mentioned the other night at our tech run that Enigma machines were available commercially so that
Yes. Yeah.
you could get several for Bletchley Park, right?
That's right. So the Enigma machine was invented in the late 1910, I think about 1918 or something, as a concept. It's what's called a rotor machine, where there's rotors inside of it that turn with every click of the key with every keystroke and change the permutation of the machine with every letter of the message. So that concept was invented early after the Second World War. And Enigma, the company, made these machines for banks to use, or for any company that wanted to send secure traffic. They made these available. So Dilly Knox in the early 30s went to Vienna and bought one of these. So these were known quantities, but the trick is in how they are wired and how they are programmed for each individual message. So you could have an Enigma, you could have all the pieces in front of you, but unless you know the combinations and the settings and the permutations of how it's set up, then there's very little chance of getting into it. Most cryptography is done through brute force attack, which means just trying every combination of the machine until you get the result you're looking for. But
Like a safe lock, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just try every one and eventually you'll get it. But the Enigma machine had over 150 quintillion settings. So that
No, that was
literally eons to try every setting
wow.
to break it. So doing it by hand was not an option whatsoever.
And so they brought in the smartest people that they knew. But the Poles were getting close, were they not? Can you
The
talk a
Poles,
little bit? Sorry.
yeah, the Poles were the first to crack the code. So the Poles were breaking messages in the early 1930s. I mean, the Germans were their neighbors. They knew that the war machine was gearing up again, and they were skeptical. So they started watching, paying attention to German radio traffic, and knew something was up. They recruited mathematicians from the universities to be three particular individuals to work on the Enigma problem. And the main guy there was Marian Rejewski, and he was able to deduce. They had a commercial Enigma as well, and he was but through some spy. There was a spy involved here. It's a great story, but there's a German spy who was giving information to them through a French officer. With that information, with just pure mathematics, he was able to deduce the settings of the machine and find some flaws in the way the Germans were using the machine in order to start breaking messages. So the Poles were well ahead of everybody, and they didn't tell anybody. They didn't tell the French or the English, not until the invasion of Poland was imminent did they actually tell the English and the French the progress they had, and shared the information as well as their mock-up of the Enigma machine with the French and the English so they could start working from where the Poles had left off.
So can you tell us a bit about the Lorenz machine? How does that tie into all of this?
Well, the Lorentz machine is a different coding machine that was used by the German High Command.
Okay.
That's a tangent off the whole Bletchley story.
That's viewership number
viewer
two.
number two. The Lorentz machine has its own amazing feats of mathematics. There's a man named Bill Tutt who cracked the Lorentz machine from one single message that was repeated without having seen the machine at all, deduced how it was made. They basically, Bletchley Park invented the first digital programmable computer ever to help crack this thing. And like you said, after the war, it all went in the garbage. So Bletchley Park got zero credit for inventing the computer. Nobody knew what happened until this all came out in the 70s and 80s. But a lot of stuff happened at Bletchley Park that all just went in the dustbin after the war. And a lot of people who did really amazing things didn't get the credit they deserved until now. And interesting Canadian tie-in, Bill Tutt ended up moving to Canada and Waterloo, and he taught at University of Waterloo. And no one ever knew what he did until just before he died in the late 90s.
That is fantastic. And yes, just to reiterate that if you were in one part of Bletchley Park, you could socialize with your friends. There was a lot to do there. There were theatrical societies, there was badminton, there was all sorts of things to try and build this camaraderie. But you didn't know what the other people were working on. The slogan, "Careless talk costs lives," was everywhere, and they took it really seriously. And the firsthand accounts that you read, I can't imagine what it would be like to go back having done this amazing work for the war, and especially for all of the women who worked there, get home to their husbands and it's like, okay, I'm baking pies again, I'm raising, like this entire part of their life is completely shut off. So another thing that I wanted to bring up was the Gauss Key Sheets, because they're a pretty prominent thing as well. Can you talk a little bit about how they tie into all of this?
Yeah, sure. It kind of jumps back to how the Poles were breaking messages. So early on, so before the Gauss Key Sheets, there was one way the Poles were cracking messages, and that was with basically they're looking for fingerprints. The way the Germans set up their machines lent messages to let configurations of the machine have certain fingerprints. So you could build yourself a small machine. Once you knew how the Enigma worked, they built a machine called a cyclometer and went through every possible configuration of the machine because there were less then. And it also ignored certain feet. It took orders of magnitude. There were certain things they could ignore that reduced those numbers by orders of magnitude. So they could focus on a particular part of the machine. And they would catalog every setting of the machine. And when they took messages for a given day, they would look at the preamble of the message. I have some slides of this later. I could get into more detail.
I'm really excited.
Anyway, they basically look for fingerprints. So if you group a bunch of messages for the day that were all set up the same way, then you could look in your catalog for that particular fingerprint of that day that was left by the machine and look it up, and those were likely the settings for the day. And they'd have to try a bunch, obviously, maybe like 150 but by the end of the day, it's better. 150 is better than 150 quintillion. So that was at a time where the Germans prescribed how they set up the machine. And again, I can talk more about this later. Maybe I'll jump to Gauss Key Sheets. The Gauss Key Sheets were a different way that they, once the Germans changed how they did their codes, they had to scrap the cycle method and go to these Gauss Key Sheets, which basically, it was a different type of fingerprint that left by the machine, where they could make these perforated sheets. They had a grid sheet. They had one grid for every particular setting of the Enigma. And once they got a bunch of messages for the day and looked at the preamble of the message and how, which letters, there was some stuff that's in the plain text of the message. It's not encoded. There's information in there that they could use to make these sheets. And if you take these grids and the particular instances of these little fingerprints and stack them, there's the holes in the sheets line up, and eventually more holes will get covered and more holes will get covered, and it'll leave one hole shining through. And if you reference the grid of the light shining through this one hole that was left over after you stacked all these sheets, that was probably the setting for the day. And again, it was 150 tries over the course of the day, but that's better than 150 quintillion.
They kind of look like crossword puzzles. I think you have a picture. Do you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So when we get to Mike's fantastic slideshow, you'll see the Gauss.
Do you want to jump right to it?
We can if you want.
Sure.
It's our Zoom meeting.
Yeah.
We can do whatever nerdy thing we want.
Sure. I'm going to share a screen then. Boom. I hope that people are seeing this.
So everybody, this is Bletchley Park Manor. As you can see, it's a gorgeous Victorian era home that, if you go inside, it's beautifully, the hardwood floors, amazing ensconced fireplaces. I charged my phone in Deniston's office, but when you first arrived at Bletchley Park from whether you were coming from wherever, if you're coming from London, so if you're a tourist after the pandemic and you go, it's about an hour and a bit from Euston Station, and it takes you here. But one of the interesting things about the people who came here is that they had changed the names of the railway stops to confuse the enemy, which I think is just amazing. And a lot of, you see in Imitation Game, Keira Knightley's character, Joan Clark, arrives during the daytime via bus, but a lot of people arrived at night, and a lot of women injured themselves just getting through the dark from the train station here. Now, one little aside, Mike and I just have to tell this story. So Mike and I, years ago, had played Guitar Hero back at your old apartment at Bathurst, and the only beer you had was Hobgoblin. And
I got it as a Christmas gift, or so one of those gift sets of novelty beer.
And Hobgoblin became a running joke for like over a decade. And when I was in Bletchley Park in November 2018, as soon as I arrived at the Manor House, it's gated, and there was a bottle of Hobgoblin and it was like the spirit of Mike was there. But this is where all the magic happened. And then they build the huts and different buildings around the main manor house. So here we are, Mike. Yay.
Cool. So let me see here. Next slide. Here we are. So here's just a picture of how the Enigma machine was operated in the field. You'd have this gentleman here. He's reading a message on the lid of the Enigma machine. He's typing in the message, but he's not reading what comes out. I'll show you a little bit closer what the machine looks like in a second. This guy here, he's looking down. He's reading what's coming out of the machine. So what happens is, as you press the key, a light will pop up, and the light will be a different letter than the one you typed in. And he's reading out the letters to this guy here who's writing it down. Now, it should be clear, the Enigma machine, all it did was scramble letters. It didn't send messages. It didn't write or like receive messages. All it was is it was an elaborate word scrambler. So then this guy here would take the message and then Morse code it off to whoever was supposed to receive it.
Because codes had been used, paper codes like Playfair ciphers, there's a million different ones that were used in the First World War.
Ciphers, things like that.
So people had been, scrambling things, and you needed a key, but this took away that part of that, and it just kept it in a little bit more of a compact.
Yeah, this left it seemingly random. So the Germans really thought their stuff was randomized and really impenetrable. So this is a sheet. So Rachel just mentioned a key, and a key is basically the settings that you need for the day. As long as the person receiving the message and the person sending the message have the same settings for the machine, then they'll be able to use it. So this is a typical sheet for early 30s. This is before the war. This is which rotors are put in the machine. Let me step back for 1 second then and show you the machine before I get too much into this. I'm gonna stop.
Because the rotors, that's gonna be fun.
So this is my replica of an Enigma machine. It is a digital one. It's not real. When I looked into how much it would cost to buy a real Enigma machine, I think a working one is in the neighborhood of $250,000 to $350,000. So they're out of my price range. So I had to make my own.
You just had to make your own.
I had to.
You know how to make one. Okay, I'm just putting. Sorry, Mike. I'm just putting you on. We're leaving out a speaker view there.
Cool. So I'll give you a quick tour so you know what I'm referencing while I'm talking. So you have your indicators here. The rotors of the machine. Remember, it's a rotor-based machine. What letter they're on, in most cases actually a number, shows through these windows. So this machine is currently set to a ground state of what is it, AMZI. There we go. That's better. And when you press the button, you can see, I think you can probably see the letter U lit up there. And if I keep pressing P here, I'm pressing P, now W is lit up. Now, if I keep pressing a key, the Q is lit up. And you'll see the L over here keeps changing. Every press of the Enigma, change. These rotors will turn. So you'll never get you'll rarely get the same letter twice for the same, enciphered the same way. You'll never get a P enciphered A. One of the flaws of the Enigma machine was a letter will never be itself. So a P will never encipher as a P. That's key. That's something the polls.
Interesting.
And it will very rarely encipher to itself again. And the Enigma machine like this was available commercially. When the German army decided they were going to use it for their own things, they added this plug board on the front. So you could actually swap letters for one another on this front. They would have up to 10 plugs. So you could swap A to D or E to F, and those would be prescribed for the day. And that actually is, this plug board is actually more complicated. It gives you more settings than these rotors. There's 150 trillion ways you can put 10 plugs in the alphabet like that. So that was actually a huge part. But what was funny is you could actually ignore it for the purposes of doing what the polls and what the bomb did. So that is basically a quick tour of an Enigma machine, the outside of an Enigma machine. Inside the Enigma machine are a bunch of rotors. That's those 4 windows there. The 4 windows were actually on a Navy model. The most Enigma machines for the Army and the Air Force were 3 rotors. And you can see these wheels here. They had sprockets on the inside. I'll turn this around. The numbers there represented letters. So it was just the Navy that had letters on their wheels. Everybody else just used numbers and would have to convert. And as you click if I press this, it's like pressing the keyboard. As you click this, it spins that first wheel around. And sorry for the squeaky wood, but it would spin that wheel around. And what would happen was eventually when you got around to a certain point on the Enigma machine, it would keep going and then it would click and it would turn the next wheel too. So it's kind of like the odometer of your car. Every time this wheel turned 1 revolution, it would turn the middle wheel. Every time the middle wheel turned 1 revolution, it would turn the next wheel. So it was always randomizing itself. The wheel order, they had 3 rotors to begin with. Eventually they had 5, and so you could swap the order of the rotors. You could swap that there was a reflector here, so that you would swap. I'll explain that in a little later. But what was also really tricky was you could change the wiring of the rotor relative to where it turned over. This is called the ring setting. So there's a little clip here. You could open the clip and turn the numbered wheel around and change the wiring relative to the letter. So you could do that on wheels. So you would have your wheels, you'd have your rotors chosen, you'd have the order they're in, you'd have the ring setting or the wheel setting that you would choose, and then you'd have your plugs. And I'll show you, this is a relic rotor. Here, I don't know if you can see, this is rotor. Let's try to focus here, boop. This is rotor number 3, the Roman numeral there you can see. And there's also dots on the inside. I don't know if you'll be able to see those. just inside there.
I see some numbers there. Yep, I see it. It's
Just
like
inside there,
little
there's 3
dice.
dots. So that's how you can see which rotor it is. You can see the numbers around the exterior here. These are this kind of wavy part here is the thumb wheel. So you could turn the rotor in the machine. It has contacts on either side. So there's these pegs, these sprung pegs on one side that would squish against the rotor next to it. And there are smooth contacts on the other side that they would rub along. So the power, the energy, like when you hit a key, it would create a circuit that would go through the plug board. Ooh, going back to my other prop here, it would go. So the power would go through the plug board, in through the rotors, get scrambled about, hit a reflector here, and go back through the rotors again, back through the plug board.
Wow.
Then light up one of the letters.
So no wonder it was so complex. Like it.
So this is what's called a paper Enigma machine. It kind of visualizes what is going on inside, so you can follow the path of a particular circuit. It would go through blah 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 blah, hit the reflector, and then come back and out. So that kind of visualizes how complex the inside of those rotors were.
That's amazing.
So I can jump back to the screen share here, or maybe I'll show you quickly. This actually will come apart. And you can see inside here, that's where all the wires are wrapped around, because not the connector here isn't connected directly to the one on the other side. It is woven through and they're all scrambled up. And each wheel has a different scramble. So if I go back to sharing my screen here, where am I? Lost. Oh, there we are. So we go back. This is a setting page that the guy running the machine would work. So these are the wheels. You have to put in wheels 1, 3, and 2. This is the ring setting. That's the clip I was talking about. You would set the rings to 16, 11, and 13. And early before the war, in the early 30s, they would actually be told what ground setting or what position to start the machine in. And that was a big problem. That's how the Poles ended up creating that cycle method. Since all the message started with the same settings, that's how they deduce a certain fingerprint. So that's the ground setting, what each rotor should look like, what number should appear through the little window on the lid of the Enigma machine. These down here are the plug board settings. So there were 7 plugs they used at this time. And these 2 things are indicators for who should be receiving the message. So that's not exactly germane to the conversation. So you got wheels and their order, their ring setting, the ground setting for the machine, and the plug settings. So my scroll wheel's not working for PowerPoint. Nope. This is an example of the information that the Poles accumulated to get the cycle method. Each message started with this preamble up here.
Okay.
So this is information about who's sending it. This is the date, and this is or something to do with it. The year's not indicated here. This is that ground setting that is known by everyone. The ground setting is known by everyone. So this is the key to the message. So the key is sent here. So what the operator would do is set the message to the ground setting, 11222. He would type in a key of his choice twice. So he might choose the word cat. So he would type in, with the machine set to 11222, he would type out the word cat twice, and he would write down what that scrambled to. It scrambled to NQSHUV. So the person receiving the message would set their machine to 11222, type in NQSHUV. They would read cat, cat, and they would set their machine to cat, C-A-T, and start typing out the message here. And that's how they got the secret. That's how they traded the key to for every message. They sent it in the clear, but scrambled in that ground setting. This is a sheet for later on in the war. They changed it every day. I think at that time of the previous sheet we were looking at, they changed the settings every month. but this is from 1944, but it was like this at the beginning of the war too. Here's the date. Here's the date in this column. Here's the wheel order. So you put in rotor 2, 4, and 1. Here's the ring setting. So you'd set the rings to 6, 17, 26. And here are 10 rotor pairs. But what they didn't do is prescribe the, they didn't prescribe the ground state. That could be chosen by the operator.
So that's so neat.
So this is a message that would come up at this point in time, where this is the ground setting. So the guy's saying, hey, set your machine to HYN. And then type these 3 letters. And if you type these 3 letters, you'll get, again, cat, cat. So then you'd set your machine to CAT in the Windows, and then you could type out the rest of the message. So even though, it's important to point out, even though the Bletchley Park, the polls are reading this information, they don't know what it means because they don't know the rotors, they don't know the ring settings, they don't know the plug boards. So you can send this wide open in the air and nobody will know what you're talking about. We're talking, this is an example of the second way, this is the Gauss Key Sheets here. So I can go into a bit more detail. They were exploiting what were called females. And this is just a big list of all of those 3-letter combinations that they were collecting. They collect them at the beginning of the day and look for instances where the C in cat, remember if we do cat, cat, we're looking for instances where the C in cat were enciphered to the same letter. Remember, it's rare that it does that, but it's not impossible. So if you collect all the message or a bunch of messages for the first couple hours of the day, as soon as they change the message at midnight, and look for these instances of the letter being encrypted, the C in cat being encrypted to the same letter, that is the information they used to create the Gauss Key Sheets. They created the instances of this happening. So they knew the first letter that the machine was set up as to make the C, and they knew the C happened twice, so they could make these sheets that helped them stack, that they would stack to create it. So here's a couple sheets stacked up. So you can see there would be one sheet for every letter of one of the wheels, and then the rest of the letters for the middle wheel and the outside wheel are here and here. And they would punch a hole every time they knew one of these instances would happen, because you could go through every setting and record that. They would record every instance where a letter would encipher as itself, put it in these sheets, and take all the instances of that happening, stack the sheets up in a prescribed way, and eventually you can see how there's some gray squares there. As you stack up, less and less of these white squares appear, and eventually you'll only have one remaining, and that is the likely setting for the day. So that is the way the polls, the second way the polls broke the Enigma code, exploiting the fact that the Germans encoded that cat key, the key of the message, twice. So that's just a crummy close-up of them together and how the sheets are stacked up and blocking the light coming through. So they would do this on like a light box or something, and the light would shine up through it. So when was it? May of 1940 is when the life of the code breakers fell apart, because they started exploiting this, using these females. This is some of the information that they shared, the Poles shared when they got together and told the French and the British what had been going on. So the British and French actually helped them make these sheets, because it was a time-consuming process. I think it was in May of 1940, the Germans changed their protocols and they stopped enciphering the key twice. They stopped doing cat, cat, and just put cat. And that threw
everything off.
Everything out the window. So they were left with almost no ways of reading Enigma traffic. But thankfully, Alan Turing was working on the bomb, which was a way for them to take a known part of a message and use that to find the settings, to reduce the to narrow down the settings of the day for the Enigma machine. So this is an actual German message, that the way they would write it out before sending it. Here is the date, an indicator, number of letters. This is actually the number of letters in the message, which you could exploit. Like the Germans were always keen on putting more information, and they thought they were really clever, but you could actually use a lot of this information to deduce things. And then here is the ground state of the machine, and here is the key. And this is it typed out, BUOIHO. And in this, they call this one a blackout at Bletchley Park. But they were still able to break codes in a certain way. And Rachel, this is where Harible tips come in.
Yes, love this.
So some clever guys, there was a clever dude by the name of John Harible who would think, like, if I were an Enigma machine operator, that's a really boring job. So what I might do is take, when I'm doing my rotors for the day, I'm told which rotors I have to put in the machine in which order. I'm told where I have to send, how I have to set these wheels. And what you would do, you'd take the 3 rotors, you'd put them on a shaft and put them in the machine. Harible figured that human nature is to keep the settings that you were told to do up. So the guy would be holding it with the machines that were, with the instructions that were written down facing up. And he would probably plop that in the machine with them facing up. And when you close the lid, those are the letters throwing the machine. Those are the letters showing through the window of the machine. And if you're a lazy Enigma operator, you'll probably just go click, click, a couple positions, and start your message. So they knew just through bored human nature that the possible settings for the machine were in that range. So that narrowed it down to, a few hundred again. So, and they're mathematicians. So they would do math and figure out the statistics or the probabilities of it being within a certain range. So these guys are doing statistics and probabilities constantly for every step of the way to try to reduce their work. So they would use a little bit of probability and figure out what setting it would probably be based on Mr. Bored Enigma operator putting the wheels in the machine. Because they're getting a bunch of messages from different operators too. So they'll get a bunch of messages within the same range, and then that just narrows down the probability of it being, the setting being in that area.
And I think it's good to point out that the messages were constant, and the men and women who were working there were constantly receiving new messages. It never stopped. It was 24/7.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's important to know, like, even when they weren't able to read the messages, they were still able to see where the message was roughly coming from, like what frequency it was on. If they could direction find, they could triangulate where roughly the message was coming from and how many messages were coming. So they're still tracking that information. That's called signals intelligence. So if a whole bunch of messages are all of a sudden coming from Warsaw direction or Paris direction, something's up in Paris. So it gives you a clue to, like, send a scout, send reconnaissance or something in that area and figure out what's going on. So there's lots of clues just by the sheer number of traffic coming from certain places. So
and weather, right? I mean, there were several Bletchley operators who just listened to weather reports because
weather. So thanks. No, these are when you say weather reports, suddenly my mind goes bling, because weather reports were a big way that they were finding cribs. So crib is a piece of plain text, or like that you could put against the enciphered message. And if you could match up if you had a good idea what the message was and what it might say, that's how you got settings for the bomb. That's how you set up the bomb. It was
like Heil Hitler from the Imitation Game film, right?
Like that moment in Heil Hitler.
The really kind of inaccurate,
extremely inaccurate, yeah,
but very entertaining film. But it's that moment where, like, oh, I figured it out at the pub with, like, Matthew Good and this pretty girl, and then they all run back. And
actually that was the entire basis of the bomb machine. So he was looking for known sentences,
right? And I think that, Mike, I did want you to point this out, that a lot of people think because of that entertaining but inaccurate film that he created the bomb. Alan Turing created the bomb knowing that he would need this level of statistical probability, and that you would need to find patterns, right? And what I enjoy is that it's not only for people like you who have that side of the brain. I mean, Mike's well-rounded. He has it all. He's the artistic director or the technical director of the opera, but he also has that side. For people like me, the human nature element of this is hugely why it was so successful.
Yeah, you mentioned the weather report, so that's a bit about the bomb, which maybe try to
Sorry.
Put a pin in that, and
putting a pin in that.
but because I'm gonna talk about another thing they talk about in the movie is sillies at the bar. They're like, oh, silly is this guy. This woman's in love with a man, and oh, who's this man? Oh, he's a German operator. He's a radio operator, and that's true. They would know individual operators by how they typed, or the women who were listening were so good that there was you could know who was typing, not just by their frequency, but how they were typing. Guys would use their girlfriends' names. Like, that's all true. The silly that I'm about to talk about is actually the name of a girlfriend that was commonly used. There was an operator who used his girlfriend's name all the time, and they noticed this. So that's where the name silly came from. It's like short for the German variation of Cecilia or something. What's my next slide? It might actually be sillies. Oh, yeah, sillies.
There we go.
So sillies, during the blackout when the bomb wasn't functioning, yes, the bomb was being created because they knew they were going to run out of this feed. They knew the Gauss Key Sheets were going to stop working, because they knew the Germans would figure out the vulnerability eventually. So in the blackout, they were able to exploit a couple things. So remember that the 6 letters you see at the beginning of the message, where one is the ground state and the next is the key. So the ground state, the guy would type in CIL. I would type in CIL and then LIS, which was scrambled to PCS. So what the folks at Bletchley Park would see is CIL PSC. But they knew, like, if it came from this frequency and it was this particular operator, they knew he used his girlfriend's name all the time. So there's a good chance that the key for the message is LIS, or they saw a message that had a ground state of QWE. There's a good chance that this MDS part was scrambled to RTZ, because that's just German QWERTY, the top 6 letters on the top of the keyboard, or QAS to WSX. That's just going down the first 6 letters vertically on your keyboard, or LONSKO. That's the key for the message is probably DON, or HITUBW. The key for the message is probably LER. So these are just little human nature things. The guys operating these were not supposed to do this. These were supposed to be random results. But if you're a dude who's working, half of them are begrudging being dragged into a war anyway. Now they're stuck operating this typing Morse code all day, and typing Enigma into Enigma machines all day. You're going to get bored. So they just came. This is how they entertained themselves, and it totally gave away how a bunch of the inner workings of the Enigma. Which leads, are we ready to talk bomb?
Yes, and we should.
It's into this thing, so we should get trucking.
Yeah. So maybe you can tell us why. So the bomb was created by Alan Turing, and it is based on something else that was created before Turing got to it.
The name is loosely taken from the Bombe machine, which is what helped the Poles create the Gauss Key Sheets, or the Poles exploit that female thing. So it was a machine that mimicked a bunch of Enigma machines, like the bomb, as I'll explain, that would give you settings based on that female vulnerability. But this didn't take it didn't exploit that. This was just pure, just took the information that came in any message, not a particular vulnerability. So this is a rebuild of one of the bomb machines. And what it is, there's actually 3 different banks here. Each one is a chance to crack a message. So you can run 3 different, what they call menus on a machine. So you'd take a menu that was prescribed to you. There would be a good guess at the wheel order, because they track the messages coming that they cracked, and which there would never be the same wheel order on consecutive days. The wheels would never be used. in the same place twice, you would the Germans had all sorts of rules that actually, where they thought they were being random, actually limited their options greatly. So they always had a really good guess as to how many or what the wheel order was. As the war went on, they built more machines. They could just try more options. So each column of 3 wheels is an Enigma machine. And these are the drums. So there's 1 drum for each rotor of the Enigma. And what the bomb machine is looking for is a circuit. If you just run electricity through the bomb machine, it'll go through all these rotors and go haywire, and there'll be electricity everywhere. But if you find that one setting where all these Enigma machines line up, then you'll get a perfect circuit and the machine will stop, and you'll record that setting, and that's likely a setting of the Enigma machine for that day. So here's a close-up of the machines. You can see the brass contacts on the where the drum sits, because these drums are actually empty, and these are the actual drums that spin. So there's an in and an out for the rotor, and then it goes to what the machine does have a reflector. These boxes on the bottom here are actually the reflectors, and the reflector bounces it back through the machine again through the outside rings, and then to a register on the other end. This is what the back of a drum looks like. And it's all these brushes for every, so there's 4 rows of 26 brushes, which is the number of letters in the alphabet. And the wrens, part of their job was always adjusting these brushes, constantly making sure, because if you had a short circuit in the machine on any of these, 36 wheels on each channel, the machine wouldn't stop. So they would actually run a couple machines with the same menu just in case there was a short and a machine wasn't stopping.
So the Wrens were the Women's Royal Navy. And
Thank you.
They were the ones who, in Hut 11, which is where the bomb was established, and later different bomb machines, one created by Welchman called the Agnus Dei, or Agnes. The Wrens, they were the ones working these machines all the time. And they had to be strong, and a lot of them, they preferred tall women because there was so much navigating with what was happening. Sorry, just de-acronyming.
No yeah, Welchman's actually my secret Bletchley hero. Well, Bill Tutmore is, but Welchman gets a raw deal because he was cut out of the movie, first of all. He was line to Hugh Alexander. But Welchman made a huge improvement to the bomb early on that made it work a lot better than Turing had designed. So he had an idea that would help create this mess of electricity, like I was describing, a lot more efficiently, so they would get less false positives.
And he's written a book called The Hut 6 Story, which you can find. Like, Welchman has recorded his experience, everything he did. He was based out of Hut 6, lots of mathy stuff going on in there, but I'm with Mike in that he was the master. He was the man behind the making it administrative powerhouse. He was the one who really organized the place to do the things like signals intelligence, cataloging, tracking all this information. He knew it would be important, so he's the one who pioneered it all. This is the back of the bomb machine. So it's a mess of wires that I'll describe to you in a moment. Here's a close-up view. So there's all these contacts. There's the letters of the alphabet you can see in the middle. There's ins and outs. There's commons. That'll all become hopefully clear in a second. So this is a message that the people in Hut 6 would get. They would take this message and they would try to, if they knew who it was coming from, like a boat weather report, thank you, they would listen for especially particular messages coming from a boat in the Atlantic that was there for the purpose of giving weather reports. So every day, this boat at the same time would send a message out with a weather report. So if you listen at that time from that direction, and they were German, so they probably had a prescribed way of doing it. This message, maybe not this one, but the message coming from the boat probably started with weather report. There's an instance of a guy in North Africa who every day he was so bored, he I love this guy.
And he would write nothing to report. So every day, Bletchley Park would receive a message from somewhere in North Africa that said nothing to report, which is a perfect crib for, if you knew what the message said, it was a perfect crib for setting up a bomb menu and then breaking the messages for North Africa for the day. So they were like, leave that guy alone. Don't go attack him. Leave him in his place and let him send his nothing to report messages every day. It makes their job easier. So here you see this is those 6 letters, the ground setting and the key, and then this is the message. So if you get a message from presumably this boat in the North Atlantic giving weather reports every day, you would take this is a menu that a bomb operator would get. So it's kind of a map of that circuit this is the circuit they want to create in the setting up of the machine, and this is how they want the wheels on the drums on the bomb set up, and this is how they want the cables in the back of the machine set plugged in. And then this is actually after the fact. These are the settings that they got when the bomb actually stopped. So, like I said, you're listening every day. This report is coming from a boat in the North Atlantic, and you're pretty sure it says weather report. But you don't know exactly where in the message it says weather report because the message is gobbledygook. So, like I said, the major problem with the Enigma machine is that one of its major flaws is that it you can never encipher the letter as itself. So you could slide the word weather report. This is German. I don't speak a lot of German, so I don't know how that's pronounced. But you slide that along somewhere near the beginning of the message, and you find a place where none of the letters match up. So here the E's line up. So you slide it along one space, and you found a spot where they don't match up. So that's a pretty darn good guess that EGMUOXY blah 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 is actually the cipher text of weather report. So that's how they would guess these cribs, or that's how they would guess these cribs. So here's a different instance. The ciphertext is different, but we'll go with this. So what they would do is take the clear text or the crib and match it with the ciphertext and kind of create a little grid of how all the letters, like it's almost like a Venn diagram of how the letters relate. So you can see here, G is enciphered to R here and R here, but it's also enciphered to L over here. And it's basically a map of how every letter relates to itself in this crib. So you take that and you can see, so this is position 1 so remember, every time a letter is clicked, the Enigma machine rotor turns once. So this is the first position of the crib. This is the second position of the crib. So the rotor combination, the right-hand wheel is clicking once every time you're pressing it. So the next slide is basically this will be the setting of a theoretical, this will be each setting theoretically of the Enigma for that crib. So you list those all down, and then you actually create how those wires are plugged in by the relation between the two here. So it's like this, maybe for part 2, we can get into this in more detail, but for the purposes of moving along, if from this graph, you could get how you set up the bomb.
And what's so interesting,
might be a good time
yes, we need to look at the bomb simulator, but what I find so interesting is the fact that the women who ran these machines, they would be on 12-hour shifts in this drafty, horrible, cold hut. Their fingers were probably frozen. A lot of women wore, like wherever you wore your gloves with your fingers cut out. And they would have to be so precise in turning everything. It was a lot of, if you worked in Hut 11 where the bomb machines were, you were given a really rigorous, they used to go and give like UV treatments to women, make sure that they had ultraviolet therapy, gave them lots of citrus if it was available, just because the job that they did with the bomb machines was so demanding.
So eventually they got, as the war went on and the bombs were working, they made more and more bombs. So there were outposts. There were places outside of Bletchley Park where there would be a room with hundreds of these things and wrens working them. So here's a cool bomb simulator online. If anybody's interested, I can send them to it. They can play with it. There's a tutorial on how it works. It's really great. So here's those 3 banks of rotors, or drums as they call them. And again, each column is the 3 wheels, 3 rotors of an Enigma machine. So you would set this stack of rotors to the settings for one letter. You would stack this set of rotors for the setting of the other letter, like that list I showed you of the ZZY, ZZX. These rotors here are the indicators. So when the machine stops, this is where you get some of the information that gives you the likely ring setting for the particular message key for the day. left side, on the side of the machine, are those rotors that you saw in the picture of the actual rebuild. And this is the right side. So this is where you could input a couple switches. And this is the register. This gives you the next bit of information you need to do the next step of cracking the code. So if the machine stops, one of these letters will be lit up. And that'll give you a potential one of those plug board settings. This is the machine actually set up. So I've actually, for that particular setting we were looking at, it's set up for rotor 2 on the top, rotor 5 in the middle, and rotor 3 on the bottom. And then on the back of this thing, you can see how it's set up as prescribed by that in-out list that was also shown. So this is the wiring for the back of the bomb. And then I go back to the right side. So here's the register. And then, so what you do is you'd go to the controls, you'd start her up and wait for it to stop. So it took about 20 minutes. The Lorenz would be sitting there, maybe 20 minutes per bomb. And if it didn't stop at all, then you knew you had the wrong settings, or maybe there was a short in one of the drums. So the Lorenz would have to deduce what's wrong, or maybe the menu you got from the folks in Hut 6 was no good. So you'd have to figure out why. So this runs for about 30 seconds or so and stops. I have one I baked earlier on this tab, but this will probably end in pretty shortly. So they could be running at the same time a different menu on this bank. There, it stopped there. They could be running a different a different message on this bank and a different message on this bank if they wanted to. The machine is now stopped. So what the Wren would do is look at the gold wheels on the side here and see that it stopped at S, N, and Y. So that's a good indication that the ring setting is for this particular message and crib is, or sorry, for this particular menu is S and Y. And then they would go to the right side and look at what letter lit up, D. So that means a perfect circuit happened through the machine, through all the rotors, through the reflector and back again. And since no other electricity got anywhere in the machine, the bomb stopped and gave us these settings. So that's not it though. In the movie, they do this and then Hail Hitler, oh my God, we solved the war, everybody's happy.
Yeah, everybody's good.
Yeah, it's a little more, it's way more complicated than that. So what the Wren would need to do is take this information and throw it into what's called a checking machine. And a checking machine is a way of going through that web of letters and making sure there are no logical discrepancies. So with the plug board, so if you're going through that web and you're like, in the web, there's a G. And if you plug in the settings, if you plug in the ring settings you found on this wheel with this, that little dot, so what was it, SNY or something like that. So you put the wheel settings on this wheel and you put it to Z, which I think was the instance of one of the wheels. And through here, you could deduce what the plug board settings were, basically. So you go through, but if the plug boards don't make sense, if you're testing G and it gives you D, but then you go and test something else and it says D is going to M, that's a logical foul. You can't have that. They only encode as themselves. So they knew the Wren would say, oh, that's a false stop, and they would keep running it until it stopped again. Or maybe that crib didn't work. They don't know. But
so Mike, this is a really complicated and very arduous thing that they're doing. Yep. And how much information would, I mean, we're seeing a whole cycle here. What would this produce?
So this would produce the following. Let me see if I can jump back to, where are you? This one. So this would produce this. So this is one I actually did myself. So I took a secret message, took a message of secret message that had this. So the plain text was secret message, and the encrypted text was this gobbledygook. I don't know how well you guys can see this. Hopefully you can. I knew the wheel order was 213 and the reflector was B. I created that web as you saw. I created the list of where you turn the drums to on the front of the machine. I created the list of how you plug in the wires on the back. And then these are my attempts at the checking machine. And you can see in here that J enciphered to M in this instance, but J enciphered to R on this instance. So you knew that was wrong. But on the second stop in the machine, ER was enciphering to RE and QM was MQ. So that from those were the plugboard settings. So on the front of the machine, you'd be plugging N to K, E to R, T to J, and there might be 1 or 2 missing. You wouldn't get all 10. But you take the ring setting, you would take the wheel order, and you would take these plugboard settings, punch them into a mock-up of the Enigma machine, and start typing away the ciphertext here, and you should get close to secret message. What you might get is secret massage, where the A is an E or something, but then you had a good indication that maybe you just had to, maybe a plug A needed to be plugged to something else. And then you could deduce the rest of the plug boards by doing that. So I think there's one instance, you could figure out the plug board settings by using that checking machine. So at the end of the day, you've confirmed your wheel order because it was right. You've found out the wheel settings, and you've deduced your plug orders. And it also takes some fiddling of the rotors because maybe the middle wheel turned in the middle of this, who knows? You could deduce from all of this what the actual proper settings were. As you're typing out the German, if some words start getting corrupt, you know that you make one adjustment here, and also you type it out again, and then the text might be correct. So you have to fiddle with it. But all it's done is taken that 150 million possibilities and boiled it down to 20. And by then you can do it just by trial and error.
And there's so much intuition. So the Wrens, the Women's Royal Navy, they would work on the bomb machines. They would get this, they would feed it into the other huts, and then the women who had the Enigma machines would type it out, and then it went through so many different filtered processes in that everywhere at Bletchley was part of the same brain, but it was broken down into so there's the Wrens.
They would have to get to know German. They would have to know military shorthand, like they would have to know particular units or particular commanders, because if that's part of the crib, the person running the checking machine would have to know what they're looking for.
And they'd have to know where to send it after they had, because not every message was relevant to where they were working.
Totally, yeah. Once the message was cracked, they would send it to the machine, to the typists to get it typed out, and that would go to Hut 3, where it'd be translated and then skimmed over for relevant information to see if it was useful. But this is a bunch of Wrens working a bunch of Enigma machine, or bomb machines, sorry. You can see the indicator wheels, rotors here. You can see the register here where that letter pops up in those switches. And then back at the end of the room, you can see a checking machine. And then later in the war, they moved the checking machines one beside each room. She looks very happy because apparently this is near the end of the war. They used to keep the checking machines in a room where it was a lot quieter. Then they moved them all up beside the loud bomb machines, and the women hated it. So I'm very impressed sitting there beside the loud machine. And these things were really complicated. So there's a little, I don't know if that's an oscilloscope or something, because they were constantly under repair too. So here's an actual checking machine in the wild. I think this is a rebuild as well. It was rebuilt with when they did the bomb as well. So there's the drums, and there's this dummy drum here because they also had to crack 4 rotor Enigma messages. And then the messages, once the settings for the particular key were given, were known, the messages would be given to these women here, who would type out the messages there. So these are, they have really funky typewriter machines. These are called Typex machines. Typex is what the British used to encipher a lot of their messages. They actually ripped it off the Enigma, but made it better because they made it so that letters could encipher as themselves. So even the British method of encryption was modeled off the Enigma machine, but better. But these are modified machines that acted like the Enigma. So they had little plug boards on the side, and they would do all that and change the rotors. This one, you can see this one is up close. It's modified to act like an Enigma. You had the plug board here, and you put the rotors, the Enigma rotor settings and ring settings in here, and you can type it out.
And something to note, when you're at Bletchley Park, you see how noisy everything would be. People's feet on the cement, outside noise, phones ringing, people yelling because they've found something, all the typing going on at once. I think that it's quite fascinating that the men and women who worked there had to work under these situations. The constant stress and the constant noise would have been an absolute circus. But also, really, this is why, you had said earlier that they wanted people who could speak different languages. They wanted people who had intuition. They wanted people who would be able to determine, what admiral's name. They really wanted smart people who had lots of different skill sets. And I think that that's what makes this such a unique and fascinating world.
Totally. There, I'll stop sharing there. In a nutshell, I mean, I don't know if questions are coming in at all because I'm not on the Facebook feed, but that's a shortcut to how the bomb worked. And what it's important to say that it was really important that nobody knew that this was happening. So they would crack a message that said there's a convoy, going to supply troops in North Africa. So they wouldn't just read the message and go bomb this convoy. They would have to have a plausible excuse as to why they knew. So they'd always send out an alibi. They would send out a scout plane, for instance, and make sure that plane was seen. And then when that convoy was eventually attacked, they'd be like, oh, that's that dang plane that saw us. Instead of, the Germans were being listened to almost the entire time.
Because they couldn't let the Germans know. And this is something that the imitation game brings up, that they had gotten so far with Enigma. But it's also interesting that messages from several years back were kept and filed and archived. And that's
what's interesting is one thing is, it wasn't just one setting for a machine for the entire German army. There were what were called nets, or the British actually called them keys as well, if that's not confusing. So different units would have a different setting, like each the army had their own thing, the Air Force had their own thing, the Navy had their own thing, and the Navy actually knew that there were flaws in the Enigma and made really complicated ways of programming it. So there's actually even longer blackouts. The Battle of the Atlantic was affected immensely by the introduction of a fourth rotor in the Enigma.
Right, and that set them back, and they had to.
Yeah, and that goes on. Speaking of terrible movies, that U-571 is kind of based on them trying to break the Navy codes, because they couldn't do it until they actually captured code books from submarines and boats, so what's called pinch raids. And I think David O'Keefe, the Canadian historian, he actually has a case that the Dieppe raid was actually a pinch raid, an attempt to go get these code books in order to help Bletchley crack the
right. So actually, we just had a question about the code, because in the First World War, that is how they, if you had a German code book, you could decrypt a lot. So when we're working with Room 40 and the Admiralty from the First World War, that precursor to Bletchley, couldn't the Allies just steal one of the cheat sheets the Germans had in order to decode?
Yeah, and again, that's eventually how they had to crack the Navy's codes, because not only were they doing the Enigma, it was hard to get cribs for the Navy because they were also using codes for the words they were using. So instead of cloudy day on the weather report, it would be OB or something. So unless you knew that code too, you couldn't find a decent crib.
There are just so many layers, and there's so many different elements that went into this, because they had to watch the land, the air, and the sea. And if
the Germans knew that their code books had been stolen, or that a rotor had been stolen, they would just change the code. They had a procedure for that. So these pinch raids had to be done quickly, and so that nobody would suspect that the code books were taken. The code books, especially in the Navy, everything was written in water-soluble ink, so you could take the books and chuck them in a puddle or chuck them in the ocean, and then you lose the setting. So the officers had procedures for destroying the equipment before they were captured, which is an excellent segue to my next show and tell. Rachel, you haven't seen this.
A toy I haven't seen.
I left this as a surprise for you.
Oh my goodness, this is cool. Oh,
this
God.
Is an Enigma machine, but it's a little worse for wear, because when speaking of segue, when it was assured that they were going to be captured, the people in charge of the Enigma, the signals officers, had to destroy their machines.
Right.
So this machine, good machines are hard to come by. So I'm left to collect the rusty broken bits. So you can see this one. This is the plug board up front, and it's been kicked in the front. The keyboard here is bent in. I have different examples of rotors here that have been smashed with a bayonet and cracked because their procedure was destroy all the things. If you were in the Navy, you chucked it in the ocean. If you were in the Army, you would open the lid. There's the rotors on the inside. There's the reflector here, the lamp panel, and the keyboards. The keyboard here. You'd take the rotors out. You'd put a grenade in the middle here, and you'd put everything back together and run. Well, it looks, from the stuff I've seen, you can see a lot of these rotors are cracked and broken. From the stuff that I've seen, it looks like they smashed it with a bayonet. I bought a Relic bayonet too to try to match the thing.
Of course you did.
It's in my closet. My baby was sleeping, so I didn't take it out. But their instructions were destroy the machine. And of course, if you put everything in blue grenade, these things would fly all over the place and get cracked. That was the procedure. So it was hard to capture a useful Enigma. But there are instances of like the guy on the submarine forgot to throw the rotor overboard and they found it in his pockets later. But as far as the Germans knew, the procedure was this guy had to throw it overboard, so he must have. But the guy didn't tell anybody, and the English took it, so they kept him, locked away, not to tell anybody. So they had the new settings for the four-rotor Enigma. You can see the lamp panel here. There's an example of one that would have plugs in it. That's what the steckers look like. I don't know if I can pull one of these out. I never tried.
So we did have another question. Sorry.
Yeah, fire away.
Is there, and I'm going to say instinctively, I don't think that there's a huge connection, but is there any connection with the Enigma messages with Camp X here in Canada?
Ish. I think.
Ish, yeah.
If you read, we had listening stations here. Like we were listening to traffic, and we would relay that stuff to Bletchley Park, or they had American bombs too. Americans actually made much faster, better bombs, especially to break the four-rotor Enigma. So we were listening and we were helping. We had Wrens in Canada doing similar work for sure.
And yeah, I want to plug my book here for a second. So the listening stations, that's what my heroine Diana does. My next two books, London Restoration, Mozart Code. It's women, Sophie Villiers, my heroine in Mozart Code, worked with the bomb machines. Diana works with the listening stations, and it's more how their time at Bletchley influences what they're doing during post-war espionage. So that's how that ties together. Sorry, just doing an awkward author thing, Mike. Back to
plug the book. We forgot to plug the book so far. Yeah, I think, what do we have, minutes left? So yeah, if you got more questions, that's great. And I can just dog and pony some of my other stuff. So this is another lid of an Enigma machine, which clearly met either the butt of a rifle or somebody's boot upon destruction. I don't think, it wouldn't have the film in there for the letters if it was a grenade, I'd imagine. And again, more rotors that were hacked by probably bayonet before the guy was captured and then chucked into the woods. Yeah, then a reflector. So here's the reflector. You can see it has let's focus. It has the sprung pins on one side, but nothing on the other side. It has just crisscrossy wires on the inside that flip the message back through the machine.
So war was complicated, and there were several different wars happening during the Second World War, which, went on 39 to 45, but even before then, they were anticipating the war. And that is how Bletchley Park started, with that shooting party. And even before the war, they were recruiting and starting to think about the people that they wanted to work here. And what I find so interesting is that without what was happening behind the scenes, which didn't get the same level of medals and glory as the people who were out on the front, not saying they shouldn't have gotten that, but all of the men and women who worked in this really rigorous, intelligent, and arduous job were left out of the story for a very long time. And on VE Day, one of the major, Bletchley has twofold influence. One, in that we realize that a lot about what we know about computing started there, even though it didn't transfer. But also the fact that Bletchley Park and the work they did in cracking Enigma shortened the war, some believe, by as much as 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
And saved thousands and thousands of lives. So there's a war of minds that happened. And what happened at Bletchley sets us up for the way that espionage and cryptography helped during the Cold War. So it kind of was a path into the next step of cryptography. But it's really remarkable all they did in such a short period of time. Just a few comments here. Even in such poor condition, that is amazing. It is amazing. It's just so neat that you have the replica too, Mike, that you constructed so that we can compare and contrast.
Yeah. There are two questions. I was sent 2 questions. I don't know if I can throw them out there from me on Facebook a while ago. Why didn't Marian Rejewski, the Pole, get the same amount of attention as Alan Turing?
Yeah.
And I think one of the main questions is Alan Turing was renowned for his work in computers already. So his name, he kind of had a history after the war too. And then the circumstances around his death also were notable. So his treatise on on how computers might work, he's the first one to imagine that there could be a machine you could program to do to do whatever you wanted.
Right.
So that was the foundation of computing. So he's known for that. And the Poles were kind of left in the dust, like, frankly. They eventually, 2 of them ended up at Bletchley Park. One of them died en route. And they were just left to do Joe jobs, basically. They weren't in the thick of running bombs or doing cool stuff. They were just kind of given some other tasks and really left in the dust. The other question he asked was, any lessons from the Enigma machine or the bombs that would translate to the digital world today? I'd say the lessons that I would take is, like, somebody's always listening. I was watching a seminar about after the war, the major supplier of crypto gear, this place called Crypto AG in Switzerland. They supplied crypto stuff, like machines similar to it, kind of like Enigma, but way more complex because technology changed. They supplied the world. And it turns out, it just came out a few months ago in the New York Times, I think the New York Times, Operation Rubicon. They were owned by the CIA and the German equivalent. So the CIA was the one selling all of this crypto gear to all the countries of the world. So people were being paid to be spied on by the United States and Germany. So somebody's always listening. But that seminar ended with, we're in a digital world. We all have, like, NordVPN or whatever. We have crypto in our phones. So I think it's very naive to believe that governments of the world don't have backdoors into that information.
Right. Especially now. I mean, there's this whole thing about contact tracing and how we're going to be using apps in, I don't know if you've heard about this pandemic. It's called COVID-19. A few other, I'm blown away by the manufacturing.
My son wants me to plug this book.
Oh, that's the Welchman book. Thank you, Luke. That's the Gordon Welchman book, the Hut 6 story. It's a fascinating, very mathy look.
Very
if
mathy.
you want to read other books about just daily life in Bletchley Park besides my fiction, you want to look for Sinclair McKay, MC. I'll post later, but Daily Life in Bletchley Park. I've got one here. That's just sitting.
And I'll stop interrupting
at my
you,
desk. The Secret Life of the Code Breakers just takes you into this. Sorry, I was reading a comment. They must have made hundreds of them. The manufacturing, they must have made hundreds of them. And if the wiring was off at all, it was useless. Must have had some serious quality control and testing. And I think that that's interesting because you like maybe a COVID vaccine, we might not have, people were just trying to get these things done. And of course, there were different iterations. The first was Turing, the second was Welchman. But do you want to speak to that, Mike, on quality control for the bomb machines?
Well, I think what the British are excellent engineers. They were already working on, like, telephone circuitry and things like that. So making things was in their wheelhouse. So the people who built the bomb, it wasn't Turing in a workshop building these bombs.
No.
Design was built by tabulating machine companies, phone relay companies, and things like that. So the British, this is totally their thing. So yeah, quality for sure, quality control, like those brushes on the back of the of the bomb drums. Those are that's a shoddy concept. And the American bomb had solid brush contacts that were you could run them faster. They're way more efficient. So some American ingenuity went into fixing that. But sure, there were always issues. You see that one picture where that oscillator was there. People were fixing them all the time, but they ended up having hundreds of them, and one would go down, and they would run messages redundantly. So if one was breaking, they were still trying to get a proper hit from a different machine running the same crib.
And then another question that I think we covered earlier. So was there a previous iteration of bomb before the one that was actually used?
Yeah, Turing had the first bomb was delivered to Bletchley Park before the Gauss Key Sheets were no longer useful. But that was Turing's slow bomb that didn't have Welchman's diagonal board, like Welchman's idea.
Yeah.
So that's the first iteration. That wasn't great. But then they implemented Welchman's idea.
So imitation game kind of conflates those two.
Yeah, Hugh Alexander has his line and it drives me nuts.
Yes. Hugh Alexander, they portray as quite a cad. So yeah, that's, what was I gonna say? Just the fact, and in some ways, everyone, the bomb, the Enigma, what they did was so scientific and complex, and yet in other ways it was just so they used to use a tea tray and a tunnel to send messages from huts 3 to 6, which are adjacent when you go to Bletchley. And I just think they were just innovative in how they got these top secret encrypted messages that they've decoded with these amazing machines that are so ahead of their time. And then okay, who's got a tea tray?
The place is pretty primitive. The huts, they were building these huts so fast to house more and more people as they did more and more things. So if you go to Bletchley Park, that place was in shambles 15 years ago, and they've really done a good job.
They've really changed it. And the other thing is that the workers at Bletchley would billet with people in the neighboring towns. And sometimes, you'd take the bus at the end of the day to go back to wherever you were, like Leighton Buzzard and all these little Milton Keynes. And it was really quite arduous, but it was also, given, our current pandemic circumstance, very isolating. So the people who were there for a very long time, and there wasn't a lot of contact with the outside world. And the contact that you did have would be blighted by the fact that if you talked, you could be tried for treason. So it really was drilled into them. And the fact that they just didn't speak is phenomenal to me, because overtired, emotional, in the middle of a war, far from your family and friends, and you don't speak about what you do at all. And they didn't even talk to each other about what they did. And
they did such amazing things. It's a shame. It's amazing Churchill called it, the geese that laid the golden egg and never cackled. And it's true. Nobody knew anything was going on until people started writing about it in the 70s.
And Churchill did visit Bletchley Park. And that was a big day for them. When Winston Churchill, there's a lot of firsthand accounts about how it was just wonderful that he took the time to acknowledge them, because it was a thankless job. And yet it was these men and women, again, 3 times as many women as men who were working there, who went back to their regular lives without even being able to tell their spouses. I wrote a book about that. my awkward, but
right on time too. 8:29 ended with. I'm happy to stick around if anybody wants to listen.
Yeah, we clearly have a lot of enthusiasm and nowhere else to go. But
I got an epilogue if anybody's interested.
But you can see, everyone, here why, when I wanted to include the workings of Bletchley Park, that I wanted to raid Mike's extensive library, of which he has a fantastic one, but also pick his brain. We had one back, when you could go and eat lunch with your friends and hang out. Remember those at the time before? I just sat with a notebook one day, and you've been invaluable, Mike.
Happy to help.
Help me research, but
nobody talks about this stuff with me, so it's nice to have somebody who will listen.
Yeah, he was like, "Oh, toys."
It's a very lonely hobby.
One of the great things you did was help me shape. That's where I got the listening stations. That's an entire other part 2 about how you could listen. And of course, in London Restoration, my heroine hears Mozart, like there's a daily symphony concert that they hear, and how that pervades what's going on at Bletchley and then thereafter. But there is a question: how easy is it to see inside the digital Enigma? Should we bring out?
Yeah,
Should
sure,
we
I gotta move
bring
the
out the
real one.
toy?
Yeah. I mentioned I had an epilogue, and I really do. So one of the big things was the Germans' overconfidence in their technology, and their poor way of rolling it out. Before I haul that over, I wanted to show one more thing.
Yeah.
They this was in the late stages of the war, trying to complicate things further. They actually made a reflector that was pluggable. So this is a reflector you could take apart and replug, just like the front of the plug board. And it did make it more complicated, but the operators hated using it, so they didn't do it properly. And it wasn't rolled out all at once; it was rolled out in a couple places at a time, so they could the Bletchley Park could really take advantage of the shoddy rollout of German protocols, because they were so overconfident in their technology.
And yet, we got to give it to them, because it took forever for people to crack this Enigma thing. They definitely had something going on there.
Yeah.
So we're going to look inside the Enigma. But Mike, another question that we have here is, not to go off on a totally different tangent, although, hey, we can do sequels. And if no one comes, Mike and I will just talk to each other. We're fine.
I was thinking, Rachel, we should just do a bomb run.
Yeah. Man, we're nerds.
Full disclosure, I didn't make the circuit board. This is there's a place called Cryptomuseum in Holland, and they collect all things crypto, and they sell this board. So I mean, you have to solder everything together, but the case and everything, I wanted to look as close to a real Enigma as possible.
And
so
it's pretty authentic. So can you talk about how the computer stuff got figured out after all the Bletchley Park material was destroyed? Well, Sonia, one of the things is Alan Turing at that point wasn't destroyed, so he went on with his research, and of course the men and women, the men who worked there. But we talked about this the other night, Michael, about how if we had just kept all the stuff from Bletchley, wouldn't we have a computer like a lot? These guys could have been bazillionaire Apple people.
Yeah, poor guys like Tommy Flowers, who literally built a computer before anyone else and it couldn't tell anybody about it. If the Brits had patented any of these vacuums and relays and all that stuff, or these concepts, they think of the money they could have had. But instead, but it did, like the machines eventually were made in the universities where all these guys came from. So I guess they had to play stupid a little bit, go back to school, help reinvent the computer. But they missed the boat on being the first. Like it's crazy.
Oh, Enigma. Yeah, and they really did that Official Secrets Act. And I mean, even recently in the past year, we've heard from women from Halifax, from Nova Scotia, who actually worked at Bletchley Park. And there are marvelous firsthand accounts by women who, there's a book about the Debs of Bletchley Park, and that's my heroine of Mozart Code, Sophia Huntington Villiers. She's a debutante. So of course they looked for academics to work at Bletchley, but they also wanted to hire people who came from, again, Britain is a very class system. So they wanted to hire women that came from affluent families, because they thought that there was an inherent level of trust there. So all the big family names, people from estates, they would often get a lot of those women to work there by virtue of the fact that you are from a rich family. We can probably trust you not to give all of our secrets away.
Yeah, not only that, but they're the ones who went off to Switzerland to boarding school, so they spoke German.
Yeah.
Or had knowledge of German.
Oh, it's so many women involved, yet the names we know are men. Is that a reflection of the history written, or is that the truth in the positions that people had? Well, the men had obviously more leadership type roles, and the men were, of course, a woman could not be a commander in the Admiralty the way that Denison was. But again, I think Joan Clark. There were a few women who, when you go to Bletchley, they're focused on. I'm forgetting a few of their names, but Joan Clark is the one that is featured in the Imitation Game, and she was quite impressive. I recommend Googling her, but I think that women ran it, but in so many other things, it just
they went back to their daily home lives, which
yeah.
is, and the men went back to their, maybe if they're officers, that was, maybe they were career officers after that, or a lot of the guys stayed in intelligence for a long time. I think who wrote the first books, Winterbotham, he was in charge of the special liaisons. He lost his clearance for writing his book, so he somewhat ruined his career by spilling the beans.
And I think it's interesting because the women that were there, a lot of them were from universities, and you kind of ran out of options. You could stay in London or where you were and like work for the Red Cross or sew things. Or there were universities in Wales where you could go to Wales and be safe and continue your studies as a woman, or you could work in this really interesting place. And a lot of the firsthand accounts from women, you're a woman who is now stuck at a manor house with a ton of math nerds, like the social a lot of women talk about how socially awkward it was because these are brilliant men, but there's no engagement. So there were some love stories that came out of Bletchley Park and moments by the pond where there was like amorous moments, but it socially it was a complete divide as well. It was like it would be an amazing social experiment, this microcosm of all these people thrown together.
Yep. Cool. Any other questions up there?
We can scroll through after too and pick up any that were just left in the comments. If anyone comes by later and comes and listens to our nerd-tastic
last call for instant response. Plus or minus 20 seconds.
Can you talk what kind of encryption systems were developed soon after World War II? What were militaries using during the early Cold War?
Oh, great question. What was hilarious is since the Enigma thing nobody knew about it, that people kept using the Enigma machine. Yeah. So that's funny. But also this company Crypto AG that I was telling you about, or that I was talking about earlier, they developed all kinds of different they were still rotor-based machines. They were just more complex. They would like print out things. Some would send. I can't really speak to that, but the rotor machines, until computers became much more prevalent, people were still using these rotor machines and just not the same way Enigma was. Just way more complex versions of it. Like the American equivalent that they use, the M209 is the machine they used during the war. It's also a rotor machine. Just more complex. Where what I think is really sad is not only that the whole fact that the Colossus, the computer they invented at Bletchley, didn't see the light of day at the end. What that whole story is it deserves its own movie, deserves its own attention.
Yeah.
Like Enigma's cool, but that story is like way cooler and blows my mind that those stories aren't out there as much as that one. But sorry, to answer the question, there's more rotor-based things that were used, but I highly recommend a website called Cryptomuseum. They're the guys who did that lecture about Operation Rubicon that the States actually owned this company. And you can go down a rabbit hole of every crypto device ever created at cryptomuseum.com.
And I just had a question about sharing a book list. Well, in my my historic note for London Restoration, I kind of send people to my Goodreads. Now, not all of the books that I referenced from Bletchley are available on Goodreads, but there are some ones there. But I'll share a list of what I've been using, and then Mike has like.
What do you want to know? That's the problem. So, Rachel, your wheelhouse is like the people of Bletchley,
and people in daily life and all that. And Mike,
I got a couple of those books, and I couldn't get into it, but I could get into the mathy nuts and bolts stuff.
Whereas I read the Welchman book, and I was like, "Oh dear Lord, make it stop!" Like, yeah. And those little pamphlets you loaned me about the listening. I was like, "It's
the pamphlets really, are amazing.
They are amazing." But honestly, and we can take this in the comments, but there's so many layers to this place.
I have so many books, but they're all like, what's interesting is as this all came out, everybody jumped on their opportunity to write a book and cash in. So it's all about, since nobody knew what each other was doing, every book is about one niche area of it with general explanations of what they thought other people were doing. So you really can get granular with it.
And no one's written about the pigeons at Bletchley though. And yes, I will do
World War I
of the, but there's an entire exhibit called Pigeons at War when you go to Bletchley Park.
I still have some of their armbands or footy bands or leg bands.
So yeah, I'll check out the Goodreads. I'll share some of the ones that I have. This one's really neat on the day-to-day life.
Yep.
Again, my books aren't set at the flashbacks are set at Bletchley, and that's kind of how my heroines prepare for life after the war and when they work in espionage. Yes, the Hut 6 story that Luke brought to us.
Good place to start is this one for sure.
And I think that, thank you for saying niche, not niche. Well, that's because we're Canadian. But if you get, once the pandemic's over, again, it is an hour away from, here's my little book. Mike, you have yours. They're probably slightly different because we went at different times.
Mine's on my bookshelf. I've got the other tourist one, How the Bomb Works, which is very interesting.
That's a good one too.
This is written by the nephew of Alan Turing. The nephew, Dermot Turing, is a huge Bletchley historian and has lots of cool, there's lots of good YouTube videos by him, but he's basically taken his uncle's work and run with it. Pretty cool.
And so if you're ever in London, you can go,
really easy.
Euston Station, you take the train just to Bletchley and you can spend hours and hours there. It's one of the most interesting experiences and you really get a sense of what life is like. We have one more question here. Yes, and Hobgoblin. Do you know of any German cryptologists that were assimilated by the Allies after the war, similar to scientists like Werner von Braun in Project Paperclip?
Oh. Questions? No, I think no. Short answer is no. There's Luke. Good night, Luke.
Hi, Luke. Good night.
Yeah. Oh, it's not bedtime. Okay.
Oh,
well, we get to hang out then after this. Luke is seldom on the internet, so that's a rare sighting.
That is, yeah. Luke and Sam are kind of just like my tiny nieces and nephew. We just keep them off social media. But oh, my
house is in disarray as I prepared for this, and I do have a book.
Well, it's because you guys are both working with 2 kids at home during a pandemic. So
it's actually propping up my computer. I just got a book about German intelligence and what the Germans were doing to break codes from the English and the Allies or whatever. So I look forward to reading to see if there actually is a connection. But nothing that I can think of because they weren't that good at it, frankly. The British and the Americans were much more strong and probably, weren't interested.
So, well, it's 8:45. We should probably wrap this up. We will do more in this series, even if it's just you and I talking this nerd-tastic stuff. I mean, think of all we could do. Mike knows every lyric to Wicked. That's what we do on our road trips up to the cottage. We can do the Valjean Javert song. There's so much to tap into here. Mike, thanks for doing this. You are amazing. Again, everyone, Mike Ledermueller, he's the technical director at the Canadian Opera Company until June 30th. If you Google COC or Canadian Opera and you make a donation, it will be matched by an anonymous donor. And we need theater and opera to survive because either that or it's just going to be our Facebook Lives for the rest of time. And I think that people want something a little bit more advanced. And I will do one more plug. You can currently pre-order the London Restoration, and it comes out with HarperCollins on August the 18th. And then next year in June, the Mozart Code. And both of these books feature women in very interesting roles in Bletchley and how they use what they learned there, as well as the relationships they established there after the war in the Cold War. So yay. Woo. All right. Are we good?
Camera 2. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, Rachel. That was fun.
Thanks, Mike. Have a good one.
How do
Talk to you immediately.
Do you remember how to hang up?